So I'm going to be talking for the next 45 minutes or so about how we manage this tension, the tension that you will clearly have felt between the picture that you have seen from Orlando about how to drive long-term growth, the kinds of qualities that he identifies from his research that shine out in the ads that achieve that so well, and the tension between that and how we drive results now, how we invoke that sense of brand in order to activate sales right now, which you saw done so well in Marlon's presentation. There is a clear and huge tension between these two. The data set I work with, I should add, works with, of course, much less powerful and entertainment-oriented brands than Sky. Sky, in many ways, is a very, very special brand. Its brand speaks for itself because it's in everyone's living rooms. It's very, very powerful, and it is in the world of entertainment. So how do we manage this tension if perhaps we're working with brands that operate at a much less engaging and entertaining level in people's lives, whether it's a brand of cheese or perhaps a new banking product, which can't rely on those kinds of levels. So that's what this is about. It's about that tension. I'm going to explore lots of issues and areas that I think show that this is not easy. It is actually much, much more difficult than it looks for reasons I will come to. And when you can and do it well, then that is a remarkable thing. For most brands in most situations, I'm going to be arguing it is probably not the best way to think. Anyway, let me move forward. You've seen the evidence base. I'm not going to talk in detail about this. Unusually for me, I'm going to be pulling together essentially outputs from 4 different publications in order to look at how brand building works really to drive long-term effectiveness and how it needs to work alongside short-term sales activation and how we get these two working both together. I'm also going to talk about the incredibly dangerous impact of short-termism on marketing today. So the first half of my presentation is really a warning. It's a warning about the seductive logic that says, let's not worry about the long term. Let's just ensure that we have a good week, month, or quarter, and somehow the long term will take care of itself. Now, there are a lot of, and a growing number of businesses out there have got their fingers very badly burnt pursuing that line of logic, if I can flatter it with that description for a moment. It is fundamentally untrue. If you live in the short term, you are more likely to die in the long term, and that is the emerging evidence of more and more case studies. So let's be careful about it. You know my database. This is the data that we get collected alongside case studies entered into the IPA Effectiveness Awards. It collects enormous amounts of data about the strategic intent, the creative approach, media usage, budget, and of course about the results, hard business results of the campaigns that are entered. Very simply, what it enables us to do is to examine how inputs in the sense of strategic and media choices influence outcomes in the sense of hard business effects. And when you do that, you find some really, really striking and powerful patterns emerging, but you also find that timescales of effect are a vital lens through which one has to look. I want to start this presentation really by showing you an ad. It's an ad that I don't admire, I'll tell you that up front. I think it's an ad that kids itself that it is easy to do some kind of brand building entertainment role and activate a functional promotional message. It is not this easy. It's not a perfect example of the kind of left brain advertising that Orlando has talked about, but I will argue it is very much on that spectrum. I'm going to show you at the end of my presentation an ad from the same source as this one came from, which I admire much more powerfully, and that is very definitely from Orlando's right brain school of thinking. And come to that. So this is the ad I want to show you. This, if you are a Cannes judge, and certainly Cannes creative effectiveness judge, or indeed a creative judge from many of the creative awards shows around the world, this increasingly is the kind of ad that is hot sex. Doesn't get any more fantastic than this. And I want to argue to you, and hopefully by the end of my presentation you will share my view, that this is dangerous deception. Let me play the ad for you.
want my Whopper.
Okay, you're thinking, come on, Peter, you miserable old curmudgeon. What on earth is wrong with that ad? Surely that was kind of entertaining. And of course it was. I think it's a very kind of creative promotion. It's a promotion. I don't claim to be a great salesman, but if you let me give burgers away free, I think I could probably generate some business in a few burger joints around town. I think it's a grotesque misuse of creative firepower. I really do. Really, really do. Creatively, we're served this kind of smorgasbord of abstract filmic references. I don't actually feel any great sense of engagement or empathy for this character. At the end of the day, we are using our key competitor's key distinctive asset to sell burgers. And if you are Byron Sharp and you come from the Ehrenberg Bass School of Thinking, you will see some serious red flags in that way of thinking in the first place. A key competitor's distinctive asset in my ad? Okay, I go along with the whole challenger brand thinking of saying challenger brands have always had a pop at the brand leader, but ultimately challenger brands have a clear idea about what they stand for, and their advertising tells that story. This does none of that for me. There is no brand in that to me. There is entertainment, but there is no brand. I see it very black and white. Okay, I'm being a bit of a misery guts, I know, but I think there is a really important point to be made over this kind of ad, because the point I'm making here is that this is increasingly being seen as hot sex by creative juries around the world. That will influence creative teams. It must influence creative teams in agencies, and it will influence the kind of advertising we're increasingly being served. What the hell is wrong with all that? So let me just remind us of the kind of lens through which we have to view effectiveness. If we're going to make sense of what works, we have to view effectiveness through this lens. And that is to say that there are two ways marketing works, and they work over different time frames. If we are in the business of short-term sales activation, trying to get people to do stuff now, then we are in the world of behavioral prompts, those things that make people do stuff now. They are pieces of information, typically. They could be a deal, an offer, or some product feature that if we are in the market now will make us think, these are the guys I should be doing business with. They inevitably tend to have a limited period of effect because we simply don't remember information in the same way that we remember those emotional associations and the stories that we are woven with by great brand advertising. They are inherently non-memorable. That is the problem. Therefore, they need to be tightly targeted. There is very little point in serving sales activation message that people are not about to buy. I am not going to remember your pricing structure, your tariffs, or indeed even the details of your product features in 6 months' time when maybe I come to market. I'm simply not going to remember it. The only hope I will remember is something nice about your brand. So it's got to be people who are likely to buy very soon. It is all about targeting using data and or media choices that enable us to serve our advertising message to people as close as possible to the point of consumption, because the kind of information we're serving is only relevant and will only be remembered in that time frame. But of course it exploits brand building, and it can and should do that. We're going to see data that suggests that when you get the two working well together, the tills ring. So I'm not saying it should ignore brand. Great activation ads, of course, invoke the brand, just as many of those powerful Sky ads you saw did. There is the sense of the magic of the brand coming through there to add voltage, of course, to the activation message. When you look at the kinds of messages, these are typical, powerful, short-term sales activation messages, whether they're price promotions, reminders of the product delivered at point of sale, McDonald's, the Asda ad there, outside an Asda ad there for McCain's. These are things that just remind us of our product. You're never going to remember that McCain ad tomorrow, but it's a very powerful activation ad. Because as I walked into the store, it just gave me an idea for supper. Skittles ad, again, perhaps you might think again that I'm being a bit curmudgeon here. Highly creatively celebrated Skittles ad. It ran typically in any one city for 1, maybe 2 weeks of the year around the Pride marches, during which the brand shed its rainbow colours for 1 or 2 weeks in specific stores, Tesco stores, in those towns only. It's a lovely piece of creative thinking. The online video was a nice piece of creative advertising. Why do it for 1 or 2 weeks of the year? If you're going to be creative, creativity is about long-term brand building, ultimately. It is wasted if you're only going to deliver it for 1 or 2 weeks. You don't build brands in 1 or 2 weeks, even when you have powerful ideas like that. So these are very, very different kinds of ways of thinking. It's about delivering a message that will make us do something now. And let's be clear about it. If you are into the world of pride and pride marches and you you espoused the values and the progressive qualities that that kind of thinking represented, then the fact that Skittles were going to ally themselves to that purpose was clearly going to motivate you. And the short-term uplift of sales of Skittles in stores in those towns during that particular promotional period were very, very significant. It was a great uplift. Guess what happened when the Pride marches ended and the promotion ended? You're straight back down to base level sales. I'm not saying it was valueless. I'm just saying it's not a long-term growth driver. And we have to remember that. Now, long-term brand building is a totally different ball of wax. What we're talking about here is emotional priming. Emotional priming, by which I mean creating those powerful associations around brands that make us want to choose them and that have the capacity to accumulate over time ever more strongly to influence behavior, because they are very, very memorable. They have immensely long durations of effect. Some of the ads that Orlando showed you earlier, anyone of my age will still remember those ads, although we have not seen them for decades, because they were so powerfully emotionally engaging. They need to be broadly targeted. Brand building is something we do for the long term. Brand building is something we do to bring consumers into our brand who at the moment possibly don't know us and possibly don't even like us. We cannot assume we're going to get the sale now. So they have to be broadly targeted, and they have to be targeted at all potential buyers and indeed possibly influencers in that category. So this is a totally different kind of targeting and time scale of operation that we're talking. But of course, as we will see, if we have done this task, it has a massive impact on the power of our activation activity. It turbocharges it. So the two work together. Neither can work in isolation most powerfully of the other. This is not a choice we make between doing brand building and doing sales activation. It is something we need to do both of. So if you look at some of the great case studies of long-term brand building in the IPA database, you can see what a different kettle of fish it is, whether it's the Snickers campaign, which something like 7 years into that now, still driving amazing levels of growth. Dove campaign, fantastic tour de force of how you marry brand purpose to brand building. This, to me, still, the Lifebuoy ad remains the most powerful piece of online video advertising I have ever seen. And I would say it's, I think it's a 90-second video. You will only find the brand name at the very back end. You will watch it from beginning to end, I promise you. You cannot stop watching that ad. It is totally electric. And, you know, to those who say, in the world of online video, we have to do everything in a hurry, it's always got to be in your face. I don't think that's something that Google or YouTube are saying anymore, I should point out, because even they are now recognizing the value of fantastic storytelling if we're trying to bring people into the brand who perhaps don't even know us. And then, of course, we've got Specsavers, who for more than 20 years, about 24 years now, since they first found their theme in Should Have Gone to Specsavers, have been creating these amazingly surprising and rewarding and fresh adverts that each time we see them, we never quite know what's coming until the reward at the end. These are totally different kinds of way of thinking. Different kinds of messages. They're emotional, not rational. They're targeted at different kinds of people, probably using different media and probably at different times. It is a very different world. It is very difficult, not impossible, very difficult to do two at one, to do both in one go. I'll raise that as a challenge. Now, the problem we have here, and why I wanted to start with a warning, is that we live in rather dangerous times. There is a huge deception of the short-term model. The sales activation model, without a shadow of a doubt, can generate incredibly powerful short-term spikes. If I have a powerful offer or some fantastic new product, I will be able to generate very impressive short-term spikes just by simply telling you about it, giving you some information. I don't need to do anything very much in a brand building sense to get you to get out and respond to that. But here's the problem. Because these kinds of messages are neither very memorable or often in many instances they're not long duration by their nature, they are limited in their time, there is very little long-term sales uplift. Depending on the kinds of activation messages we're doing, we may even get a negative long-term effect in one very important area I'll come to in a minute. We might get some small, modest long-term effect, but in the area of, say, shall we say, paid search, which is probably the biggest consumer of activation expenditure globally, I would argue there is zero long-term effect. And I've seen some very powerful econometric models from some of the clients I work with that would absolutely back that up. So let's not kid ourselves. Very important to have great quarters, great weeks, great months, whatever our business reporting time frame is. But if that is all we are doing, we are very unlikely to be driving long-term growth. We only get long-term growth if we are also engaging with the business of brand building. That is to say, these powerful associations that prime us over time ever more strongly. The great strength of that is it's not simply that we get longer term growth. The steps may be smaller in our ladder of growth because they tend not to have such powerful short-term effects as these activation messages, but because they accumulate over time, they drive greater long-term growth. But they also have one other really, really important benefit over so much of the sales activation work that you see, which is they also have an impact on pricing power. Sales activation usually has a negative or zero impact on pricing power. Only brand building is going to enable us to raise our prices over time. You can see the conundrum here. If I measure success in the short term, that's the left-hand side of my chart, I will come to the conclusion, quite correctly, but only in the short term, that sales activation is the most powerful way of driving sales uplifts, because that's all I will see, the left-hand side of that chart. But if I measure success in the long term, right-hand side of my chart, we will come to precisely the opposite conclusion, also correctly, that brand building is the most powerful way of driving growth. And the problem we have is that the cusp point at which brand building starts to take over as a dominant driver of growth, about 6 months into the life of a campaign, assuming it even runs that long. And as I've shown you, the Burger King ad, I mean, that runs for a week or two around about Halloween, I think. Now, look, let's be clear about it. I am not saying there is a choice to be made. Do we go brand? Do we go activation? You do both. Smart businesses do both, and you do both in a powerfully integrated way because you want your activation to invoke the brand and you want your brand to be able to turbocharge the activation. And I'm absolutely on the same page as you guys at Fall Off the Wall about how you ensure that you are invoking brand when you do the powerful sales activation message. But here's just the evidence to say we have to do both, which so many businesses have walked away from in recent times because they've been lured into the short-term way of thinking. So I'm going to divide my 550 case studies into 4 piles. Those that did very little for the brand and did very little for activation effects, so they are obviously going to be in the dunce's corner, measured on this effectiveness metric, which measures effectiveness across a broad range of metrics. Second column is, if you like, this new school of thinking that says all of that brand thinking, that's last millennium fluffy kind of nonsense. All we do is we drive powerful short-term sales and we'll let the long-term take care of itself. So that's the new model. The third column is going to be the old-fashioned model that said, oh, this scary performance marketing stuff, we don't do that. We're just going to stick to brand. And then in the fourth column are those case studies that do both. They do both in balance, in the sense that Les Binet and I argue for. It's probably something pretty close to the 60-40 sweet spot. Powerful brand effects, but also very strongly activating sales off the back of that growing enthusiasm for the brand. And when you do that, you can see 2 really important pieces of learning that emerge from this chart. Firstly, you have to do both. If you want to be as effective as you possibly can, you have to do both. You have to be in this camp. But secondly, that the key driver, as I've already said, of long-term growth is brand building. It is insanely dangerous to walk away from it. We are only going to be on the left-hand side of that chart. We sacrifice enormous potential for long-term growth. Oh, say a lot of people to me, and I've heard this many times. This is, believe me, I bear the scars of this one. A lot of people say to me, yes, Peter, but we work in this very agile, fast-moving business. You know, we have to be able to turn on a dime. Ooh. We've all been told it's good to be agile, and of course it's good to be agile. But I don't have the luxury, I'm told, of brand building. It works over timescales that are irrelevant to our business. Well, let's just test drive that. We're going to divide our 550 case studies into 3 piles. Those that did nothing to strengthen the brand, those that did a bit to strengthen the brand, and those that did a lot to strengthen the brand. We're going to look at the ability of those brands to activate strong short-term sales. How agile really were they? And when you do that, you relearn something we have known for decades and decades. It has been in the IPA Effectiveness Awards database in case study evidence for the last 40 years. The learning here is that if you want to be an agile business, able to turn on sales very quickly, it really, really helps to have an amazingly powerful brand behind you. The activation job is so much easier. You've got to do both. Absolutely have to do both, but don't kid yourself that being an agile business is all about walking away from brand. Big, big deception. And I just wanted to give you finally the evidence about pricing, because this is hugely overlooked in the business world. The fact is you don't have to be an econometrician to see the general drift of that chart. This measures the impact of the campaign on the strength of the brand, and the vertical axis measures the impact of the campaign on pricing power. It is pretty much a straight line. If we are not strengthening the brand, we are very unlikely to have any significant effect on its ability to command a premium. Why is that important? Well, you ask anyone at Heinz why that's important, but many other businesses as well. As Warren Buffett has made increasingly clear, and I think investors are increasingly understanding, that the single most important decision in evaluating a business to him is pricing power, because it gives you security and growth in earnings, in income. If you haven't got pricing power, you are scrabbling around in a race to the bottom in pricing. And he has, I think, been a great champion of that, and I applaud him hugely for it. But what we're up against, so, in the context of all of that, why on earth would anyone be as daft as to walk away from brand building? And here I come back to the tech sector. I think more than anyone else, I don't blame it exclusively on the global financial crisis or anything else. I do, of course, espouse the cultural shifts that Orlando has been talking about, and I think that is led by culture, but it's led by culture that has been fed to us really by the tech world as well. But this is a quote from Eric Reynolds, who was speaking at the ANA Masters of Advertising Conference a couple of years ago, which he didn't ascribe to anyone for obvious reasons, because he was criticising it, as indeed I am. But this is a quote from a marketer in a tech business. He says, "We don't have marketing run by marketers." You can just begin to sense the disdain and the derision seeping through from this left brain individual. Let's be clear about it. People who work in these tech businesses, I'm beginning to think don't even have a right brain, let alone know how to use it. But I'll defer to Orlando on the neuroscience of that. But certainly it is severely atrophied. We're engineers. Now look, I have an engineering degree. I spent 3 years sitting in lecture theatres surrounded by these people. I know the beast. I was one of them. I still am one of them. This idea that the illogical, emotional world is something, it's inferior. Oh, we're engineers. We work with science. And we work on growth. Oh, the disdain gets greater. As if marketers were interested in growth. Branding, and he ends, and this is just priceless. Branding is really that emotional drizzle that you guys put on top. Now, I hope to convince you, if Orlando and I haven't convinced you by the end of this, and indeed Marlon, that emotional drizzle is priceless. Emotional drizzle is not something to sneer at. Emotional drizzle is something to get seriously on your side. And I would certainly have failed if I haven't convinced you of that. But this is what we're up against. 10, 20 years of celebrated tech people telling us that emotional drizzle is so last millennium. We've got to fight back against it. Now look, here's a lovely example of a business that was seduced by this. You know the story, but I've got to retell it because it is so delicious. So this was the incoming CEO of Adidas in 2017. Like so many people who come into new powerful roles in big companies, he's tempted to change everything. He said, digital engagement is key for us. You don't see any TV advertising anymore. I'm sorry, what world does this guy live in? Anyway, you don't see any TV advertising anymore, probably his daughter said. All of our engagement with the consumer is through digital media. So that was the start of the experiment. At the time, I'm very happy to say that Mark Ritson called him out and warned him in his column that this was not going to end well. He referred to this as him failing his brand with an exclusively digital mindset, and he predicted it was not going to go well. Mark Ritson, of course, tends to use delicious language, such as this. When a marketer does finally get to be the boss of one of Europe's biggest brands, he almost immediately starts talking bollocks. Now, because of that, I think we tend to think, well, Mark Ritson, he's just being a curmudgeonly old botnot, isn't he? He was absolutely right, as we now know. Absolutely right. Latest headlines then, we overinvested in digital advertising. An obsession with efficiency rather than effectiveness, something I'll come back to in a minute, caused us to overfocus on ROI. Incredibly dangerous thing to do. ROI should be one of many metrics we use to judge success, not the primary one. And if you obsess about ROI, you will inevitably go down the performance marketing route. And if you do performance marketing alone, I would argue that it should be called underperformance marketing, because that's most likely what will happen. So we now know how this played out. We now know how it played out, but that is just typical of a lot of businesses that have got their fingers burnt. Few of them have been as public as Adidas have about it, and I thank them hugely. Why does this happen? Why would people make these daft mistakes? Well, let's just explore the conflict between profit and ROI. And we can look at this quite clearly in the IPA database. So these are the correlations of various metrics that we have in the IPA database with the profit metric, gross profit metric, how the extent to which profit was grown. And you can see here all the usual suspects, the things that we know are important to the growth of a business: sales gain, market share gain, penetration growth, pricing effects, and the basket of them all, the number of very large business effects, which is why we use it as an aggregate metric, all correlate really strongly with profit. Noted also up there is the number of brand effects, the fourth down from the top. So our ability to strengthen the brand correlates really strongly with long-term profit growth. No doubt about that. It's very clear in this database. Just look at the two bottom things on that list. Our ability to drive very large activation effects, it does correlate very strongly. It is important, but it's one of the least powerful correlations, but it's nevertheless very significant. We can be very confident of it. ROI itself is actually at a lower level of confidence and is the least correlated metric with the profit metric, ROI. Now, hang on, you're going to say, that seems a bit weird. Why should ROI be so weak here? Well, we have to remember that ROI is a ratio of what we get out to what we put in. Profit we generate to the cost of driving that. And there's two ways we can max out a ratio. We can either max out the top bit of it, i.e. the profit growth, the difficult one, or we can minimize the expenditure. That's the easy one. Anyone can cut a budget. And of course, that's where it leads us to. It leads us to strategies and executions that enable us to achieve modest or mediocre results, but at tiny cost, because that is the way to max out ROI. So this, of course, says to me, well, ROI is not a great metric. It doesn't say it's a disastrous metric. Let's just explore the disastrous bit, and it comes exactly from what I've just said. Because the only two things that correlate at all with ROI are, most importantly, our ability to drive short-term activation effects, because that is what we will do. It's relatively low cost to do, because we can target these messages very tightly at people who are in the market. It's low cost. It will not have such powerful long-term effects, as I've already demonstrated to you, but the ROI is going to be fantastic. We're going to get serious pats on the back for doing it. Profit, of course, does correlate with it, but a lower level of correlation. But look at all these vital metrics that are so important to the health of businesses. Sales gain, business effects, all of the individual ones, price, market share, all of these do not correlate significantly with ROI because they're not about low-hanging fruit. The way to maximize ROI is just to go for low-hanging fruit, easy prospects, easy converts, easy acquisition targets, and we'll get great ROIs. But if we want to drive long-term growth, we've got to reach beyond the easy ones. We've got to be bringing people to our brand who at the moment don't know us, don't like us, don't think of us, and maybe not even in the market yet. But we need to be doing that. So which brings me to this bottom metric. The very metric that Ehrenberg Bass Institute teaches us is the most important metric for the growth of businesses, which is their ability to increase penetration, to bring new consumers into the brand. If anything, that negatively correlates with ROI because it's the opposite of low-hanging fruit. This is the fruit at the top of the tree, really difficult to reach. We're never going to do it if we drive all our thinking through a filter of ROI. Kiss goodbye to long-term growth. And of course, that is what millions of businesses around the world have been doing. It's what Adidas did. You know, it's what a lot of businesses around the world have been seduced into doing. You can see it in the IPA data, even amongst best, case studies of best practice. You can see that the percentage of case studies that were short-term in their outlook, they were trying to drive effects over short-term periods. And I should say this is only part of the problem. This measures the duration of the campaign. There's all of the thinking, strategic thinking that Orlando has touched on, the kinds of structure, the kinds of messages, the kinds of creative natures of those ads all come in the slipstream of this. It's an immensely pervasive kind of change in the way people think. It exploded around about 2006. Whoa, any kind of faint hints of something Orlando rated? The mirror between this database, which is a totally different database to Orlando's, and his findings in terms of timing is not just approximate but precise. We picked up the same problems arising as Orlando noticed in his data when the shift from left to right, from right to left brain started to accelerate. The mirror is there. So why do I obsess with it? Well, Orlando's already shown you this. What had been a rising curve of typical effectiveness levels suddenly started turning down, and it is continuing. Even the latest data that we can look at, 2018, it continues its unfortunate slippery slope downwards. And as I say, it's not just down to duration of campaigns, it's also down to the very nature of them. It's a very, very broadly ranged thing. You've also already seen this from Orlando. In the past, I've talked a lot about the power and value of creativity. When I first started looking at this, and here what we do is we've overlaid a database of creative award wins, the Gunn Report database, with the effectiveness data in the IPA database. And when I first started looking at this about 10 years ago, we had a fantastic story because typically creatively awarded campaigns were 10 to up to 13 times as effective as non-creatively awarded ones. That started to fall a little, but held at a plateau of about 10 to 1 through most of the subsequent years. But then, as the effects of short-termism start to grow, and we're looking at 12-year aggregated data here because I need big chunks of data to do this kind of analysis. So we can't look at the precise point when this happened. But if you think about it, this is totally consistent with that 2006 cusp point when creativity started to be seduced into left-brain short-term thinking, and the slide really accelerated. So in the 12 years to 2018, we have something around about a 4-to-1 multiple, dramatic loss. And I can tell you now, if I were able to look at more recent cuts of the data with statistical reliability, you would be seeing something that is essentially a zero uplift. We have, believe me, arrived at the time when creativity, as defined by those awards judges in Cannes and elsewhere, typically brings little or no benefit to the effectiveness of campaigns. It is a horrific development to allow to happen. Once the CFOs and CEOs of the world realize what we have done, they will cease to support creativity in the way that they have just begun to. We spent more than 10 years trying to convince CEOs and CFOs that creativity is a good thing. Just when we're beginning to get them to that space, we're pulling the story out. We're pulling the rug out from underneath the whole story. It is an incredibly dismal situation that's going on. It doesn't have to be that way, and I'm going to give you some rays of light at the end. But we see this played out even within one business like Mars in the UK. It's incredibly kind of obvious. So if you look at Mars's, and I admire Mars enormously as an organisation. They have a fantastic commitment to creativity, and I think they really understand how to get commercial benefit out of it. But if you if you measure creativity by what creative judges get really excited about, you'll see that it is the Skittles kind of campaign that is really exciting. They absolutely froth over this kind of thinking. Very short, very now, very in your face, very immediate, very digital. It's absolutely the thinking of the digital era. Served online, online video, geo-targeted, very tightly time and people targeted. They absolutely love it. What they quite like is the Maltesers kind of ad. So this started out as a short-term ad. It was a competition to win free airtime on Channel 4, I think, using ads that you had to develop an ad that was around the theme of, inclusivity, shall we say. So this lovely ad about the sex lives of a disabled girl. Very, very raunchy, punchy stuff. Brave, provocative, and incredibly well judged. It was very, very successful. Of course, Mars, being a very smart organisation, realised they've got a success on their hand, and they've rolled it out, and of course it is still running today. Doesn't quite have the same sex appeal to the judges, of course, as Skittles. And of course then, let's turn to one of my much celebrated campaigns is for Snickers, which has now been running for some years. They've gone completely cold, so they do not award this campaign anymore. Now, it's unfortunate, isn't it? Because unfortunately, if you look at the numbers in these case studies, you can see that the returns increase as you move from the short-term model of Skittles, and the case study is quite overt about this. It's an activation campaign. You see an increase in commercial value to the Mars company as you move to the right. So increasingly, by awarding those kinds of short-term campaigns that creative judges are, the Skittles model, we are inevitably walking creativity away from effectiveness. It's inevitable. You cannot drive effectiveness in the short term in the same way that you can if you embrace long-term brand building. It's incredibly dangerous. I'll very quickly walk you through the AA case study because it's a lovely example of how you can get yourself in a pickle and what you have to do to put it right. So you've probably seen this chart before, any of you have been to the IPA Awards. This is a 10-year snapshot of how the AA spent its budget between brand and activation. And remember, at the beginning of this period, AA was one of the strongest brands in the UK, regularly came to the top of polls, top 5, top 10 of polls of power brands in the UK. This was an unassailable brand. Now look, it takes a long time to kill a powerful brand. These guys were really determined, and thank you for giving us the experiment. Over a period of 10 years, they siphoned more and more money out of brand building into this hard-working activation, seduced, no doubt, by the pursuit of ROI and the evidence that was able to present to the CEOs of the responsibility of marketing. So that's what happened. This is what happened to brand metrics. This is just over the second half of that period. Free fall is the only word you can describe this as. Let's not dwell on any one of them because there's no bloody good news in this at all. They are all racing to the bottom. But actually, at the time, the business results were still okay through most of that period. Because with a brand that powerful, you can still mitigate share loss through ever greater use of promotional tools and promotional campaigns. That's exactly what they were doing. Each year, they had to offer a more and more discounted come-on price as an acquisition tool, in real terms, falling quite significantly compared to the real cost of providing this service, which is much more closely evidenced by the renewal price. That's the real price of delivering this service, of course, growing over time. Now, consumers are not idiots. They soon learn this. They soon realise that when they renew, they're being taken for a ride. So you get massive defections, massive churn, which, of course, was happening. So despite this discounting surge, trying to mitigate the loss of share, they were still losing share on a massive and consistent scale. Over that period of time, they shed about 3 share points. But the more worrying point was that the projective models that they were building, which showed the non-sustainability of the pricing model that they were pursuing, predicted complete collapse somewhere within a 5-year period. Now, there's nothing like having a burning platform to encourage business to change its way. That's a pretty incendiary platform. So we know what they did. They reversed the damage over a period of 2 years, got back to investing in brand. We're told something approaching a 60-40 ratio of brand building to activation. More on that in a moment. This is the ad that they ran in 2017. Let me just be quite clear about this. The success that followed for AA was not built solely on brand building. They continued to do a lot of very powerful activation advertising. This is a still from the TV commercial, but they use many other activation media as well. So let's not kid ourselves. We're not going to turn this business around by pure brand building, but it's brand building that was lacking and therefore needed to be changed. Like I say, about a 60-40 ratio between those two. Did it work? Well, you know the story. Within a year, these guys have pretty much reversed that most recent share loss. I'm sure there is more work to be done. You don't resurrect these brands, at least to the level that they once were inside that year. But at least they are now on the way. And I think it's interesting to know, if you look at a lot of their activation advertising, there is a conscious attempt to invoke the brand there. There is a music track that vaguely reminds me of the expensive and powerful music track on the main brand commercial. I won't say that it works on the same integrated level as some of the Sky commercials we saw earlier, but there is an attempt to create an integrated brand and activation package there, and it clearly has worked very powerfully. Let's not dwell on it, but all the key metrics started to bounce back. But most importantly, they were able to drive all of that acquisition growth and resurrection of market share growth despite a sneaky policy pricing increase of about 5%. Now, if you want evidence of the power of brand building, you're looking at it. You're looking at it now. Okay, so 60-40, I think you know the shtick about 60-40. This is the shape of the curve that relates effectiveness on the vertical axis to how we distribute our budget on the horizontal axis between all activation on the left-hand side and all brand building on the right-hand side. And you can see it's a curve with a very clear peak. That peak, as it happens, is at the moment around about 62% brand, but let's not split numbers here. Roughly speaking, the peak is at about 60% brand, 40% activation. But just consider the two key mistakes that we might make as a business. One is that we might choose to put all our money into brand building, which I do not advocate, because you would see typically a 20% loss of effectiveness. But at least our brand would remain strong, and we could correct that imbalance at a moment's notice by simply dialing up our expenditure on short-term performance kind of marketing. So it wouldn't be a disastrous situation to be in, but it's not a smart place to be. What, of course, most businesses have been doing in recent years, Adidas being a good example of this, is to put more and more, if not all of our money, into performance marketing, short-term activation stuff. And this is a much, much more serious place to be, because you're likely to see a much greater loss of effectiveness, more than half. But also the problem is, as we saw with the AA example, your brand will weaken, and there is no quick comeback from that normally. It's going to take us time to rebuild that brand, and it's going to cost us real money to rebuild that brand. And we'll be trying to do that off the back of a declining sales and gross profit situation. So it is a very daunting prospect to crawl back from the left-hand situation. Much easier if you come back from the race. You have to make one of those two mistakes. Make the one on the right, not the one on the left. But of course, that's not what anyone's been doing. How do we get the balance right? The balance shifts depending on context. It's very quickly review the rules. Very simply, we're trying to get a balance between brand building and sales activation effects. It's balance. If one of those two tasks becomes easy, we need to lean into the other because we're trying to achieve balance. But of course, that tends to be the opposite. Usually what marketers do, if they think, well, sales activation is very easy, or if brand building is very easy, we're going to do more of that. That is the incorrect thinking because you need balance. So what we find here, this is where consideration is high, where people think a lot about the purchase situation. Activation is actually very easy in those situations compared to low consideration markets where people don't think very much about it. In that situation, activation is easy because people are doing a lot of thinking. They probably leave fat data trails, but they create plenty of opportunities during which we can serve our activation message to them. So the correct thing to do is to dial back activation and dial up brand. And our 60-40 sweet spot shifts to something approaching 70-30. Just been recently working with a business who is absolutely in this area of things. Their econometric model, after enormous amounts of experimentation and modelling, came out at a 70-30 sweet spot. This is not entirely idle theory. It's based obviously on a particular data set, but increasingly Les and I are finding that real world marketing and modelling for specific brands and specific markets are coming to this very similar conclusions. Of course, the reverse is true as well. Brand building is easy. We need to upweight activation, where the role of emotions in the purchase decision is very high. Brand building tends to be very easy. You know what you have to do. You have to dial up activation in those situations. So our 60-40 sweet spot shifts to something more close to a 55-45. So that's the essential principle of rebalance. And I'll spare you the details, but the balances of brand, ease of brand and ease of activation vary quite significantly across some categories. So although durables and FMCG are very close to the 60-40 sweet spot, they seem to be very typical in terms of the balance of difficulty. We see in financial services, it is very difficult to build brands for all sorts of very obvious reasons. So we need to really lean into brand building. Often very easy to activate in those situations. So we need to lean away from activation. Of course, precisely the reverse is happening. Financial services have gone very heavily down the brand abandonment route to their enormous detriment. Retail slightly shifted towards brand building. Other services is a hodgepodge, but it's interesting that is skewed more towards activation because in the IPA database in particular, there's a very strong representation of what I will call perishable services. These could be things like fast quick service restaurants or travel or media, where we need to make sure that the burger is sold or the seat is filled or the program is watched or the magazine is bought. And where the requirements for demand management are very strong, inevitably, that means that we have to lean slightly more towards activation. That makes great sense. So there are some variations there. There are also some variations over the lifespan of brands. What we find in the very early days of brands is it's very easy to do the brand building piece. There will be a virality about novelty. Brands will tend to communicate for themselves. So we need to lean into activation. Very definitely. We need to get trial. But as brands grow, they very rapidly reach an inflection point, probably within the first 2 years of a typical brand's life, where suddenly the brand ain't new, ain't sexy, ain't viral anymore. And at that point, we need to start leaning into brand building. And of course, that is a point in the growth of brands that are often missed by businesses. And very often they only discover much later that they should have been doing that. And that can store up problems. But as brands grow, the requirement for brand building becomes stronger. One of the big and very important dynamics, of course, in markets in recent years is the growth of online, not just online selling, but also online research. Both of those tend to make activation much easier. The ability to activate sales in an online marketplace is very, very much stronger than it is in an offline marketplace. And you know what that means. It means that in the online brand world, we need to tilt towards brand, no doubt about it. But of course, that's exactly the opposite of what most businesses do. Because the whole of the digital world, digital thinking, digital metrics have been so skewed towards short-term activation and the timely and relevant message kind of way of thinking. So again, so much of what's going on is simply the opposite of actually what should be going on. Of course, the growth of online selling, online research, and all of that has meant that there is a time trend in the sweet spot of the so-called 60-40 rule. It's actually morphed quite significantly now. And in the latest cut of data that we've looked at, you can see that it's shifted more towards a kind of 75-25 rule on average. But we don't draw that to people's attention. We tend to prefer that people look at the specifics of their own category. If they're in financial services, it should be more 80-20. If they're in FMCG, then it probably is more 60-40. But definitely the time trend is towards growing importance of brand, not declining importance of brands, despite what the tech world will teach us. So as I begin to wrap, let me just end with an ad. I said I would show you at the back end of my presentation an ad that I much, much more strongly admire. And this also came through Cannes Creative Effectiveness. So if I have dissed the esteemed Cannes juries, here is me making amends. I really admire this thinking. I think this is very much right brain advertising. There is an engaging, sweet storyline. There is a lovely moment of intrigue. We don't find out immediately what this is all about, but when we do, it's delicious and it builds and builds and builds. I love this campaign as well. I love this case study as well, because this was, of course, initially an ad designed for the Super Bowl, the beauty parade of US advertising. So the temptation was to think short, but of course this was very powerful. Procter & Gamble, being a company that thinks long-term increasingly about its brands, they've rolled this out and built a whole campaign off the back of what was initially a one-off Super Bowl special. And so many brands, when faced with the idea of the one-off Super Bowl kind of stage, just go the short term. Let's do something that will generate a short-term spike. But this is absolutely strategic advertising, not like the Burger King ad. Burger King ad is not strategic. This is strategic. Tide have been trying to own clean for decades, and I would argue that this particular creative outing is the most powerful thing I've ever seen from their point of view about owning clean. Let me play the ad for you, and I hope you like it as much as I do.
Yeah, just your typical Super Bowl car ad. Right?
Or a hilarious beer ad.
Or whatever ad this is.
Whatever.
But it's a Tide ad.
What?
It's a Tide ad.
What makes it a Tide ad?
There are no stains. Look at those clean clothes. What else would this be an ad for? A razor?
No. Tide ad.
Cold, refreshing.
Tide ad.
Meet the all-new.
No, it's a Tide ad. Tide.
So, does this make every Super Bowl ad a Tide ad?
I think it does. Watch and see.
The success metrics for this are pretty impressive. Something like $75 million of incremental sales, enormous penetration uplift for some of the product variants that they've been trying to drive growth for. The success metrics of the Burger King case study I will politely describe as risible. That's as polite as I get. You're lucky you haven't got Ritson here. I think he'd have some more choice words for it. So this really works. I would argue that is definitely a right brain ad, Orlando. I'm getting a thumbs up from that. There's a strong story, and there's some intrigue. There is, it's not in your face. It's not obvious. We have to work on. There's analogy in there. It is not telling me how to think straight away. It has all those qualities of some of the great time-honoured brand-building right brain ads of the past, and it still works amazingly because fundamentally we're still all human beings, and this is the thing that we forget. So let me just end with a wrap and a plug for a publication which some of you might find useful beyond the ones I already have. Success clearly requires brand building. I hope I've reinforced that in your mind, but also performance advertising. We have to do both of those. I would argue it's ideally done separately because the requirements of those two tasks are so different. Different kinds of messages, different kinds of audiences, different kinds of media, different kinds of targeting and timing. There is some evidence in this IPA database to suggest that when you try and combine those two, there is a risk that you will do neither very powerfully. But clearly, there are some situations where it is required that you do both. And in that situation, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I just don't think it's the most obvious route for success. The 60-40 sweet spot, or appropriate for your context, is a good start point. But again, there's nothing like building your own models to fine-tune your own sweet spot. But again, you should be able, all marketers should be able to have in their heads some sense of what their division is between brand building and activation. And like I say, ideally fully integrated. I don't hold up the AA campaign as a paragon of virtue in terms of integration of brand and activation. The Sky campaign struck me as much, much more powerfully integrated in that sense. You are looking to ensure that each feeds the other. Short-termism of the sort that has swept the world of marketing will blind you to the importance of brand. It will make you left brain, and it will make you walk away from the Tide way of thinking. That kind of Tide thinking is so often regarded as old-fashioned advertising. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. Brand building is getting more important. So everything I've said about this importance of doing both and balance is going to continue to get more and more important. This is not something that we won't have to worry about in a few years' time. And then finally, be really, really wary of creative fashion. I'm sure hated by the people at Cannes. I'm sure they will have ignored everything I've had to say about this issue. They did last time I warned about this. But creative fashion continues to diverge from effectiveness, and we are led, if we are led, by the kinds of campaigns that win awards at Cannes and other major competitions around the world. We're going to be increasingly led by the hand away from effectiveness. It's incredibly sad and incredibly dangerous. Now, I just end with a plug for a publication. I don't earn a bean from this, but I was asked a couple of years ago to write a booklet which summarises the argument for recommitting to brand and brand building and would take on this short-termism that is absolutely rampant in the marketplace. This is the book I wrote for the Kiwis. Why aren't we doing this? You can download it from the Commercial Comms Council website, which is the New Zealand equivalent of the IPA, for free. I don't get a bean from it, but if you need a pithy summary of the arguments to take to a client or a colleague to defend the role of brand building, that is my best attempt to put it in a short and succinct story. Thank you very much.